I grew up in a small town in West Virginia. I won't share the name of the college I attended, but it was a small university in a little town about 15 minutes from where I grew up. I was a freshman in 2021 and COVID was still an important factor in my college experience. One of the biggest impacts was on the dorms. Most students didn't stay on campus due to COVID, so they rented apartments nearby. I was poor and didn't have that luxury, so I stayed on campus and drove home for the weekend since I lived so close. I still wanted the full college experience in the dorms. On my first day, I met my roommate. We had chatted a little over text because the school had given her my phone number so we could get to know each other, which I thought was a little strange. She messaged me first and seemed nice meeting her in person. She was still nice but didn't say much. She carried a privileged attitude. One time while talking she said everyone has their own rooms due to a lack of students. I did last semester and now until you joined. I was a little taken aback and didn't know what to say, so I just changed the topic and continued the conversation. I told her I lived nearby and that I'd leave for the weekend on Friday and be back on Monday morning at 6 o'clock. She didn't say much during the weekdays. She mostly stayed with her boyfriend in his dorm room. Now for the creepy part. The first Friday, I packed my bag for the weekend and left. I came back Monday morning at 6 just like I said I would. I didn't have class until 10, so I went back to sleep. I had a thick memory foam mattress, and after lying down for about 10 minutes, I felt the edge of the bed indent. I didn't move. I waited a minute, barely processing what was happening because I was so tired. Then the mattress went back up. That's when it hit me. Someone had leaned on my bed. I turned around and saw her facing the wall, presumably sleeping. So I went back to sleep. The next weekend I left again and returned at the same time. Again, I wanted more sleep. Moments after lying down, I felt the mattress indent again, but this time it wasn't just the edge. The whole side sagged, and someone was sitting next to me. I didn't move. I lay there, frozen. And then I heard them get up. My bed was very high. In fact, I needed a step stool to climb onto it, and I heard them jump off. I held my breath and then looked over. She was again lying on her bed facing the wall. I didn't know what to think. Was I hallucinating from the lack of sleep? Was it sleep paralysis? It couldn't be. I could still move. Could someone have gotten into my room? Impossible. We were the only ones with keys. I decided I must be extremely tired and just imagining things, so I went back to sleep. When Monday came around, I was really nervous. I walked in and saw her lying down facing my bed. She was asleep, so I climbed into bed and tried to sleep as well. 5 minutes later, I felt my bed indent again. I squeezed my eyes shut, felt someone sit next to me, and braced myself to turn around. Then I felt a hand on the back of my neck. My heart sank. I thought I was going to pass out. I didn't move a muscle. They didn't squeeze. They just held my neck. What felt like hours later, I felt them finally get off my bed. I still didn't move. I stayed frozen for a few more moments, terrified, then turned around. She was facing the wall, sleeping, but I didn't care. I left the room immediately and called my mom. I didn't go to class. I told my mom everything, and she reported it to the school. I was allowed to switch rooms, thank God. They asked if I wanted to involve the police, but I said no. There wasn't actual proof she had done anything. I just asked them not to give her another roommate. After unpacking my new room, I remembered a few things. She had once told me that she had a previous roommate who didn't stay long, but she never said why. I also remembered one day she opened a locked drawer containing about 10 bottles of prescription medicine. She said it was for a skin issue. I wondered if that was true. Maybe she had another disorder or scary side effects from the medication. A few days later, I realized I had left a book and binder in her room. I didn't care much about the book, but she messaged me asking me to come get it. I told her I needed to focus on school and my new room, but agreed to retrieve my things to avoid suspicion. My key still worked, so I went in. She wasn't there, and I sighed in relief. I grabbed my belongings and turned to leave. As I turned, she was standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard her unlock it. I smiled, trying to stay calm. She didn't say anything at first. I walked past her to leave, and then she asked, "Where's your new room?" I told her it was on the first floor. She asked which hall, and I lied. She asked what it was near, the stairs, the front, the office, etc. I said I didn't remember, but she kept pressing. I lied again, saying it was near the stairs. I turned around and left, never seeing her again. I thought about telling her boyfriend, but I was too scared. I still think about it. Was I dreaming, hallucinating? I don't think so, but it couldn't have been anyone else. Only we had keys. Maybe she was sleepwalking as a side effect of her medication, or maybe she was planning something sinister. My mom thinks she was testing how close she could get to me before I woke up, and that one morning she might have actually tried to choke me. I don't know. It's in the past now, and I hope she never had another roommate again. This incident occurred during my time at university. I attended the University of Huddersfield from 2021 to 2023. It's not exactly known for its nightlife, so a lot of students end up spending late nights on campus, especially in the library or the academic buildings that stay open 24/7. I've never been the type to stay out myself, but this happened during my last year when I had no choice. I was taking an advanced statistics class, and our professor was notorious for loading us with massive assignments. The due date for one of the biggest projects was approaching, and I hadn't made as much progress as I should have. My laptop had been giving me issues, so I decided to use the computers in the business building. The business building is a little isolated from the rest of the campus. It's 3 stories tall, kind of old, and it always had this weird sterile silence to it, especially at night. The computer lab on the second floor was usually pretty empty after 9 p.m., so I figured it'd be the best place to focus that night. I got there around 10. The campus was already dead quiet, and when I stepped inside, I noticed right away how much colder it felt than outside. I swiped my student ID, heard the beep, and the door unlocked. The whole place had an overwhelming odor of cleaning chemicals, which meant that I wouldn't bump into any of the cleaning staff as they had already done their rounds in this building. I went straight to the computer lab, booted up one of the computers, and started working for a while. It wasn't bad. The hum of the computer and the tapping of my keyboard filled the silence. I kept glancing at the clock in the corner of the screen, reminding myself that I'd leave before 1 a.m. But around 11:30, something weird happened. I was scrolling through some data when I heard the sound of a door slamming somewhere down the hallway, not the front entrance. It came from further inside the building. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the air system or a janitor. But then I remembered the janitors had already come through, and by now they'd be long gone. I tried to ignore it and kept working, but then came footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps echoing from the hallway outside the lab. They weren't rushed, and they weren't faint. Whoever it was, they were walking like they wanted to be heard. I froze in my chair, staring at the computer screen, hoping they'd just pass by. Instead, the steps stopped right outside the lab door. I could see through the little window in the door if I leaned back, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I just sat there holding my breath. After maybe 10 seconds, I heard the door handle being rattled. It wasn't like someone casually testing it. It felt deliberate, like whoever it was wanted to scare me. Like they wanted to open it but couldn't. My heart started pounding. The lab doors lock automatically after a certain time, so I knew they shouldn't be able to walk in, but the way they kept rattling the handle made me feel sick. After about 30 seconds, the sound stopped. The footsteps started again, slowly moving down the hall until they faded away. I sat there in silence, debating whether I should pack up and leave. But my project was due the next morning, and part of me thought maybe it was just another student messing around. I tried convincing myself of that and went back to typing. Not even 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Footsteps. Only this time, they weren't coming from the hallway. They were above me. The ceiling in that building has those thin panels, and you can sometimes hear the pipes when the heat kicks on. But this wasn't pipes. This was the distinct sound of someone crawling or dragging themselves directly above the tiles. I stared up, terrified of what I might see. One of the tiles shifted slightly, just enough to know weight was pressing down on it. Then came this slow creak, like someone carefully lowering themselves, trying not to be heard. I'd had enough. I yanked out my flash drive, shoved my notebook into my backpack, and sprinted toward the door. The second I stepped into the hallway, it felt like I'd walked into a different world. The hall was dimly lit by buzzing fluorescent lights, and all I could hear was my sneakers squeaking against the tiles. I walked fast, trying not to outright run. I got to the stairwell, shoved the door open, and started down. That's when I made the mistake of looking up. On the landing above me, just one floor up, there was a man. He wasn't a student, and he wasn't a professor. He looked out of place. His clothes were baggy and torn. His face was half-shadowed, but I could see his mouth hanging open, like he was grinning really wide. He didn't move. He just stood there staring down at me. I bolted down the stairs so fast I almost tripped. I slammed through the first-floor door and sprinted for the front entrance. My ID card barely registered fast enough to unlock it, but once it clicked, I shoved the door open and ran across campus without looking back. I didn't stop until I was inside my dorm, the door locked behind me, my back pressed against it as I tried to catch my breath. The next morning, I went back only because I had to turn in the project. Walking into the business building during daylight felt like entering a completely different place, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the ceiling tiles was missing, the one directly above where I'd been working, along with another tile in the corner, the same one I'd seen move. It was as though someone had been watching me work, then rattled the door handle to mess with me, and when they couldn't get in, climbed back up into the ceiling to enter from there. I dread to think what his intention was if he'd entered the lab before I ran. I think it's safe to say I'll be buying a new laptop and doing my assignments from the comfort of my own dorm from now on. My name is Annabelle. I'm 20 years old from the UK, and this happened to me in high school, which is what we call college here in the UK. This was when I was 16, and I'm about to tell you about the scariest day of my life. It sounds dramatic, I know, but you'll see why. For context, my school had lanyards with ID cards on them. Although anyone could walk into the building, you could only go beyond the foyer if you scanned one of these IDs on a screen that opened the doors into the school. The IDs had your face and name on them, but a lot of kids flipped them around so you couldn't see the picture. You also needed them to open pretty much every door in the school except classrooms. The school was fairly newly built and really small, though it looked bigger because the building itself was large. 1/3 of it was a special school for kids with learning disabilities, another third was a nursery, and the last third was the actual high school. I had just started there, and I vividly remember being told on the first day to never let anyone into the school that we didn't know. The day this incident happened was the second week of school, but only my second full day because I'd been feeling sick all week. I had geography class all day, and it was about halfway through when this took place, around 20 minutes after lunch. I remember drinking a huge amount of juice at lunch because we weren't allowed to take drinks back to class, and I had nowhere to put it without it spilling. 20 minutes later, I desperately needed the bathroom. I asked my teacher if I could go, which annoyed him because we're usually not allowed to leave during class, especially since we'd just had break. But he could see I really needed to go, so he reluctantly agreed. This is important because at that point, nobody else would really be walking around the school. I rarely even saw teachers in the halls during class time. I left the classroom, went through a set of double doors into the cafeteria, which was completely empty, and then walked into another large area with a second set of classrooms. I used the bathroom and headed back the same way. But when I entered the cafeteria again, there was a man sitting at one of the tables. It wasn't immediately weird. People do sometimes move around during class hours, and technically, I was too. He looked too old to be a student, so I assumed he was a teacher or a parent and kept walking. Then he said, "Hey." I squealed because I'm a very jumpy person and hadn't expected him to speak. I was embarrassed, but he laughed and said, "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you." This is when I realized he actually had a lanyard on. At this point, I assumed he was a teacher. What I realized later, though, is that even though he had his lanyard with the ID part was flipped over so that the side with the face and name was facing the backside of the card holder attached to the lanyard. Like I said earlier, kids would do that all the time at school. The scanner would still work, so it wasn't a big deal, but definitely weird for a teacher. I didn't pay much attention to this detail at the time. I need some help getting some work things out of my car. Do you mind coming out with me for just a sec? he asked. I didn't hesitate to reply, "Yeah, of course," because I just assumed he was a teacher. We walked out of the cafeteria in silence, into the foyer, and then out of the building. I noticed he seemed a bit nervous. Teachers usually make small talk when walking somewhere with you, but he said nothing. He was also fidgeting with his hands, at one point in his pockets, then holding them together. I'm really shy and not great in social situations, so I didn't try to make small talk either. The layout of the front of the school meant we had about 50 meters, or roughly 55 yards, to the car park, which you can't see until you're right next to it because of a bunch of bushes that obscure it. If you walk straight without turning into the car park, you're off school property. We were walking in silence when he suddenly said, "Yeah, my work stuff is in the boot, which is what we call the trunk of a car in the UK. I have a few bags, so I just need you to help me carry a couple into the school." I said, "Yeah, that's fine." We got to the car park, and he said, "My car is the blue one down at the end." As we got closer, I could see something in the back seat. Then I realized there were at least 2 men hiding in the back seat. I froze, and instead of running away, I blanked. I guess they saw that I could see them because the back door swung open. Suddenly, one man scrambled out, and the man I thought was a teacher grabbed my arm as I turned to run back to the school. This guy was tall and large. For context, I'm 5 feet 2 inches and quite underweight, so I don't know how I managed it. Rush of adrenaline, I guess. I used all the strength in my body to yank my arm out of his grip and start running back toward the school. I could hear multiple heavy footsteps chasing me, but thank God they stopped soon after I started running because the school had big glass automatic doors. They would have caught up if they'd kept going. The glass doors would have been risky if anyone had been walking by. I made it into the foyer and ran straight into the open cafe attached to the library. I ran up to the person working there and told her what had happened. She calmed me down, then came with me to a teacher's office and called my parents and the police. Their security cameras in the parking lot captured everything, and the men were charged with attempted kidnapping. It also turned out that the man was able to enter the building because some kid had dropped their lanyard outside the school, which he used. That's also why he had flipped the ID over. I didn't go back to school for a couple of weeks and am still having therapy for this experience. I felt writing this whole story and sharing it would help me process things. This remains the scariest experience of my life.